So good morning, everyone. I am Maria Moreno Carranco. I am here as a visiting scholar, and it is my pleasure as a third-generation Chilanga to be listening to these marvelous talks about Mexico City. So I'm going to introduce the first panel, which is entitled Modernity in Process, Creative Practice, Urban Experience, and the City. And it's going to be a very interesting journey. With Tatiana Flores, we will be visiting artistic expressions since the post-revolutionary Mexico, avant-garde, to its influence in the 21st Mexico City. Then we have Ed McCaughan, who will present on contemporary art and activism and how this has reconfigured Mexican identity. And finally, Daniel Hernandez will take us on a tour of the lived experience of Mexico City. And we will close with remarks from Yvonne del Valle. So let's start the trip. Our first panelist is Tatiana Flores. Tatiana holds a PhD from Columbia University and currently is associate professor in the Department of Art History at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, with a joint appointment in the Department of Latino and Hispanic Caribbean Studies, a specialist in modern and contemporary Latin American art. She's the author of Mexico Revolutionary Avant-Garde, From Estridentismo to Theory. Professor Flores is active as an independent curator and art critic. She was an invited expert for the launch of the Getty Foundation Initiative Pacific Standard Time to Latin America, Los Angeles, which is supporting exhibitions of Latin American art in the Southern California in 2017. And she is also advising on two related exhibitions. Flores is a regular contributor to Art News. She's a member of the editorial board of ASAP Journal and also serves as field editor for exhibitions of modern and contemporary art in New York and internationally for CAA Reviews. Tatiana Flores will be presenting Mexico City, Avant-Garde City. So please, Tatiana, welcome.
Thank you so much to everybody here, and especially Susan Moffett, who's made the whole experience of having been invited and participating just almost like being part of a family. So she's been extremely warm and kind, and I'm also really grateful to Alex Craghead and to all the student volunteers in the audience and my fellow panelists. My work is drawn what I'm going to be presenting from my book on Estridentismo and 30-30 avant-garde movements in post-revolutionary Mexico. And I'm specifically going to be talking about the relationship between the avant-garde and the urban in the Mexican context. In December 1921, Manuel Maplez Arce launched the manifesto Actual Número Uno, an irreverent and subversive document that established Mexico's first avant-garde movement, Estridentismo, stridentism. Chopin to the electric chair, exclaimed the poet, advocating that the art should turn against passé lyrical aestheticism to embrace themes of the present moment, specifically the city and new technologies. Maplez Arce insulted local poets, disdained national heroes, and disparaged the public, adopting similar belligerent tactics as futurism and Dada. He called on his fellow writers and visual artists to become cosmopolitan, arguing that technological innovations, such as the radio and the airplane, would shrink the world and erase traditional borders, ushering in the, quote, psychological unity of the century. Indeed, Maplez Arce directed his remarks as much at a global audience as a Mexican one, including a directory of the avant-garde at the end of the text, which is this part of it right here, that names such figures as Futurism's founder, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, Dadaist Tristan Tzara, and Pablo Picasso. He disseminated his manifesto locally by posting the broadsheet in public spaces in Mexico City and internationally by mailing it to other avant-garde leaders. In the immediate aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, Maplez Arce argued that a new era required renovation in the arts and advocated that contemporary artists embrace modernity, adopting as their primary subjects the city and new technologies. As opposed to the introspective poet deriving inspiration from nature and writing romantic verses, the modern artist for Maples Arce should be a city dweller, electrified by the sights, sounds, and smells of modernity. In his words, quote, "The news is circulated by telegraph over the skyscrapers, those marvelous skyscrapers so condemned everywhere. There are dromedary clouds, and between their muscular tissues the electric elevator shakes. 48th floor, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. We have arrived. And over the gymnasium's parallel bars in the open air, locomotives choke on kilometers." End quote. In this passage extolling the wonders of modern technology, Maples Arce expresses himself dynamically, rushing through images of elevators, trains, and telegraph wires to capture a feeling of everything happening at the same time within an instant. Maples Arce's manifesto served as the foundational text for Estridentismo, which generated much controversy and discussion throughout the decade. The visual artists who engaged with it reflected on technology and the implications of modernity in Mexico in the post-revolutionary moment. The Constitution of 1917 offered free education to all Mexican citizens and land redistribution to previously disenfranchised sectors, among other benefits that promised to create a new society and level economic differences. Under these circumstances, artists faced a quandary: to renovate artistic forms and embrace modernist aesthetics, or to use art for socially conscious ends that would further the revolutionary project. On one side of the spectrum was Maples Arce, and on the other was Mexican muralism, which emerged contemporaneously. Though these projects would seem incompatible given muralism's nationalist aims and Maples Arce's internationalist ones, they were nevertheless mutually supportive. The artist Fermín Revueltas, for example, promoted Maples Arce's urbanist aesthetic in his early paintings, such as the one on the screen, but opted to base his first mural, Allegory of the Virgin of Guadalupe, on Mexico's patron saint, drawing inspiration from craft traditions. Maples Arce himself was the keynote speaker at the unveiling of Diego Rivera's first mural creation in 1923. Over the course of the 1920s, avant-garde art in Mexico oscillated between the two axes of formal innovation and social consciousness, with artists striving to find a visual language that could reconcile them. When Maples Arce plotted his manifesto, social concerns were not foremost on his mind, however. And it took his dialogues with mural painters to show him that Mexican modernism needed to adopt an ethical dimension. His contemporaries were the first to grapple with such philosophical questions as, what is the nature and function of art in the newly emerging social order? What should be the artist's responsibility vis-a-vis his or her community? And should art production be approached as an individualist endeavor or a social one? Certainly, Actual Number 1 proposed an egotistical model for artistic creation. The author both included his photograph and made his subjective experience of the city an integral part of his aesthetic model. Writing, another quote, "I centralize myself in the pulsating vertex of my unsubstitutable presentist category, equilaterally convinced and eminently revolutionary, while everybody who is outside the axis looks at each other in spherical astonishment." End quote. His convoluted phrasing, propensity to neologisms, and unconventional diction made his text deliberately hard to understand and required a patient and educated reader. On the other hand, clarity of expression and intelligibility to all were crucial aspects of public art as it developed under muralism. As artists embarked on challenging commissions, not only were they conscious of the importance of legibility, they also developed a heightened sense of social consciousness. According to the painter Jean Charlot, only the bad muralist may remain immune to social responsibilities involved in speaking with paint on public walls. Working elbow to elbow with masons stresses the fact that art is also a manual exertion, that wall painting and house painting are twins, end quote. Revueltas reminded Maplesarse as much in his 1923 watercolor Andamios Exteriores, Exterior Scaffolding, whose title references the author's book of avant-garde poetry, Andamios Interiores, Interior Scaffolding, published in 1922. As in the manifesto, Andamios Interiores is based on a new and disjointed but also very subjective experience of the contemporary city. The poems employ dissonant diction and break with literary conventions in their paean to modernity. Andamios Exteriores is traditionally seen as paying homage to the book, but I interpret it as being in critical tension with it. It introduces into the contemporary city an image of labor, calling attention to the anonymous workers who construct modernity but do not necessarily benefit from it. As a mural painter who also relied on scaffolding, Revueltas implicitly identified himself with the working class. These are the obreros here, just in these two figures here. The most biting critique to Estridentismo's celebration of modernity in the city came from one of Maplesarse's closest collaborators, Jean Charlot, a member of the first generation of mural painters. On the one hand, he willingly translated the poet's verbal style into a visual one in his woodblock print, Psychological Portrait of Manuel Maplesarse from 1922, imagining the poet as an assortment of facial features interspersed with reference of modernity, including a propeller, a smokestack, and a microphone. His contributions to the Estridentista journal Irradiador, however, denounced social inequality in Mexico, such as in the print. So this is the cover of Irradiador, which was co-edited with Fermín Revueltas and Maplesarse. And this is Charlot's print within the journal, or one of them. This is a mother and child image, and this other one here, chicken vendor. So his contributions to Irradiador denounced social and ethnic inequality in Mexico, such as in the print Chicken Vendor, where an anonymous native Mexican is burdened and subjugated by the heavy load that he carries on his back. Here, and also in the painting El Cargador, he seemed to be aiming his critique at Estridentismo for being out of touch with Mexican reality. The placement of Chicken Vendor within the pages of the Avant-Garde Journal served an editorializing function, as did the size and structure of El Cargador, resembling the front cover of a magazine. The theme of the Cargador, or burden bearer, became a leitmotif in Charlot's pictorial production, and what is clear in the painting and some related sketches is that he used the figure as a vehicle for formal experimentation. The painting contains a geometric purple form behind the man, which looks like a passage of pure abstraction with no referent in reality. It betrays the dual interests of the Mexican avant-garde in marrying formal experimentation with socially conscious themes, but I am tempted to read it also in critical dialogue with Maplesarse's call for artists to gather inspirations from pure colors and flat shapes mentioned in Actual Número 1, as though Charlot was reshifting the focus of priority. In a related drawing, from 1923, the figure is a little more than an X shape, resembling a four-blade propeller. Charlot nevertheless agreed to illustrate Maplesarse's book of poetry, Urbe, published in 1924, which would become his literary masterpiece. Urbe is dedicated to the Mexican workers, announcing a less egotistical attitude than the cult of personality furthered in Actual. The poet is no longer the urban flaneur experiencing new sensations. Instead, he is more remote, positioned above the city. City reference like trams, sidewalks, telephone posts, and elevators are mentioned, though their importance is diminished. The modern metropolis is the protagonist, but its modernity encompasses both technological advancements and class struggle. It becomes a metaphor for the Mexican avant-garde in its attempt to reconcile modernist concerns with social ones. Urbe also describes a love story which changes over the course of the text. The poet describes and addresses a woman, but the two get separated in the end for unspecified reasons. Charlot's images refer more to this subtext than to the main themes of the poem, social change and revolution. In these celebrated images, Charlot adjusted his style to match Maplesarce's words. Though there is not a direct correlation between the images and text, that is to say that prints are not a direct illustration of the poem, Charlot represented Maplesarce's meditation on modernity in a manner befitting the author's intent, through a rough-hewn planar style depicting ocean liners, skyscrapers, and airplanes, and emphasizing modernist facture, dramatic contrasts, and differences in scale to call attention to the wonders of modern technology. Charlot's own position on modernity in Mexico was that it was vulgar and appalling, and that it prevented people from appreciating the true beauty of the country represented by its native peoples. Quote, and I should say that he's a native Parisian. I'm not sure if I mentioned that already. Quote, one day, he wrote, I went out upon the streets at 6 o'clock in the morning. At 6 o'clock in the morning, fair ladies are in garage and their automobiles are still asleep. For this reason, I could look upon the true countenance of this city, so covered with ornament throughout the day that one can hardly recognize her. Deserted, the residence sections look like a music hall after the performance, but in any other part among the low, cubic, painted houses, beautiful beings people the street. There are numberless ladies of Guadalupe. They follow one foot with the other noiselessly, an ancient beauty is reborn, end quote. That was his first text written in Mexico in 1923. A series, okay, so this one relates to the one I just showed, and then this is a series of paintings contemporaneous with Urbe, which depict the city as a space rife with extreme inequality and misery. His friend and confidant, the anthropologist Anita Brenner, this is Charlot's friend and confidant, also emphasized how much he despised Mexico City. Quote, he knew the way Mexicans stand, sit, walk, dance, think, and he perceived the beautiful sculpture of familiar postures through the pitiful shellac of urban culture, which ever since the conquest has mistakenly hoped to erase the native past and the native surroundings. He noted the abysmal gap between city and village, so he went to the village, which represents the great majority of the people and which contains the real character, the real power of the nation, end quote. Charlot and other artists who sustained close relationships with Maplesarce argued that whatever could be defined as a Mexican avant-garde was not necessarily locatable in the city. Such sympathizers as painters Fernando Leal, Francisco de León, and Gabriel Fernández Ledesma all championed alternative art schools, the Escuelas de Pintura al Aire Libre, or open-air painting schools, located in the city's environs, Coyoacán, Xochimilco, Tlalpan. They promoted plein-air painting and catered to children from peasant communities from the surrounding areas. The photographer Tina Modotti made striking images of telegraph wires that coincide with Maplesarce's aesthetic, but the majority of her photographs address labor and the Mexican peasantry. Her partner, the photographer Edward Weston, was convinced that Mexico's modernity could be located in its anonymous craft traditions. And in his first mural, Fernando Leal pondered the role of the contemporary Indian in avant-garde discourse. Mexico City as an avant-garde site is also questioned in the work of Mexican new media artist Rafael Lozano Hemmer, whose art shows us how the estridentistas' dream of a technological modernity has been fully realized. Nothing would have pleased Manuel Maplesarce more than to witness the celebration of the turn of the millennium in Mexico City, validating as it did his predictions in Actual that technology would shrink the world, making possible the psychological unity of the century. For this symbolic date, Mexico's most emblematic public space, the Zócalo, played host to a light show quite unlike the spectacular fireworks on view in every other major city at the stroke of midnight. Lozano Hemmer presented the interactive installation Victorial Elevation Relational Architecture 4, consisting of 18 searchlights placed around the perimeter of the plaza, which projected beams from 7,000-watt xenon lamps into the night sky. The lights could be seen from a radius of 15 kilometers, but they could be designed from anywhere in the world through an internet site. Web users employed an online interface to create and view designs through three-dimensional simulation. Once these had been programmed, they would be placed in a queue, waiting their turn to be projected in real time and space. The user had no idea when his or her pattern would appear. A new design became visible every 6 seconds, and each would be held long enough to be photographed. The photographs would then be posted online alongside the original prototypes. Through its sophisticated technology, Lozano Hemmer's project provided a spectatorial experience that could be both real and virtual. Passers-by witnessed a unique light show, most of them unexpectedly, and then internet users were able to try their hand at programming and later examine the results. By the end of its 2-week run, over 700,000 people from 89 countries had designed light patterns for the installation, and countless others had viewed it from the ground. In his engagement both of masses of locals and a global audience, Lozano Hemmer achieved a milestone in Mexican art. Not only did he demonstrate the relationship that Maplizarse had established between technology and globalization, he was also able to address and connect to a mass audience in a manner that had eluded the artists of the post-revolutionary Mexican avant-garde. With his use of cutting-edge technology, technical prowess, and ability to conceive of and execute projects on a global scale, Lozano Hemmer has expanded the boundaries of the visual arts in unexpected and unprecedented ways. Though certainly breaking new ground, his projects also engage with significant historical models. These connections add depth and nuance to his work while transforming our very understanding of the past. When he received the commission for Victorial Elevation, he was asked, quote, to refer to a chapter of Mexican history. Well aware of the historical weight of muralism and narratives of Mexican art, he noted, quote, perhaps what could have been expected is to have a new kind of virtual muralism, consisting of projections of parading national heroes, end quote. Instead, he turned to geometric abstraction as one means of making his art as democratic as possible. The rejection of the dogmatism that came to be associated with social realism in favor of a socially conscious, abstract visual language has been a familiar tactic in Latin American art, beginning with the work of Joaquín Torres Garcia. Before the consolidation of muralism, however, Estridentismo addressed the experience of an urban modernity, stylistic innovations inspired by models in European art, and socially conscious concerns. Unbeknownst to him, Lozano Hemmer was fulfilling the promise of a text, Actual Número 1, of 80 years prior. Typically, Lozano Hemmer's use of technology is far from utopic. He employs it to make his art accessible to the greatest numbers of people and approaches the work as an open text to be infused with meaning by the spectators and which exists only in relation to them. But once the viewers animate the work, they often lack control over it, and engaging with it is not necessarily an uplifting experience. Themes of surveillance, uneven power relations, and loss of privacy recur. Rather than being a vehicle toward utopia, technology becomes a medium through which to express the contemporary condition of a globalized world. Forcing the questions of whether technology equals progress and challenging the utopic ideals of collectivism, Lozano Hemmer underscores the challenges and failures of the historical avant-gardes from a 21st century perspective, using Mexico City as his medium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for this interesting presentation. Now we have our second panelist, Edward McCaughan. He will present Art, Activism, and the New Ways of Being Mexican. Edward McCaughan is a professor of sociology at San Francisco State University. He earned an MA in Latin American Studies from Stanford University and a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Over the past 4 decades, McCaughan has published several books on social change in Mexico, including Art and the Social Movements, Cultural Politics in Mexico and Aztlán, the famous 41, Sexuality and Social Control in Mexico, Reinventing Revolution, the Renovation of Left Discourse in Cuba and Mexico, and Beyond the Border, Mexico and the US. He also co-authored this book with Peter Bright. He's currently working on a book about art, identity, and LGBTQ movement in Mexico. McCaughan is on the editorial board of the Journal of Social Justice, and he will be presenting Art, Activism, and the New Ways of Being Mexican.
I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to reiterate our gratitude to Susan and her team for organizing such a creative program. This is really a pleasure to be able to be part of this. So what I'd like to talk to you about this morning is how artists associated with or active in social movements over the past 4 decades have created new visual discourses and spaces in Mexico City that have enabled publics to imagine and enact new ways of being Mexican that ruptured once dominant notions of Mexicanidad organized around corporatist and clientelist practices of citizenship, patriarchal and rigidly gendered performances of manhood and womanhood, and heterosexist, homophobic expressions of sexuality. And I'm going to argue that activist art has contributed to the democratization of Mexico City and to a greater understanding and respect for the diversity of the city's inhabitants. So to frame the work conceptually, I draw upon the work of cultural sociologists who understand identities, ideologies, and subjects as being constituted by, not simply reflected in art. Stuart Hall, for example, read the cinema of the Caribbean and Black British diaspora as, quote, that form of representation which is able to constitute us as new kinds of subjects. And then linking those ideas to social movements, I draw upon the notions of cultural politics developed by Latin American social movement scholars Sonia Alvarez, Evelino Dagnino, and Arturo Escobar, as they argue, quote, social movements have struggled to re-signify the very meanings of received notions of citizenship, political representation, and participation, and as a consequence of democracy itself. When movements deploy alternative conceptions of woman, nature, race, economy, democracy, or citizenship that unsettle dominant cultural meanings, they enact a cultural politics, end of quote. And art is one of the more effective tools that movements have used in enacting such cultural politics. So that's the conceptual framework. Empirically, I'm grounding these ideas in examples of artwork that were produced in Mexico City in the context of the 1968 student movement and subsequent movements of artist collectives known as grupos, feminists, and LGBT activists. And the significance of the creation, circulation, and impact of this activist art needs to be understood in the context of this gradual, uneven, fragile, still incomplete democratization of Mexico, and particularly Mexico City, that began in the 1970s with the opening of the press, the electoral system, and the creation of autonomous spaces for organized civil society. So for those of you not familiar with the 1968 student movement in Mexico, let me just say a few words. It was a watershed event that helped to unleash a series of profound socioeconomic, political, and cultural changes that are still being played out in Mexico today. At a different historical moment, what really began as a series of student protests against bus fares and scuffles among rival student groups might never have grown into a mass mobilization capable of bringing hundreds of thousands of people into the streets. However, with Mexico City preparing to host the Summer Olympics in 1968, in that October, the administration of President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz was determined that order would prevail as Mexico demonstrated to the world its coming of age as a modern, developed, stable society. The government cracked down on the relatively minor incidents with the heavy-handed force of the granaderos, tactical police squads, thus sparking even greater protest by students who were well aware of the actions being taken by their counterparts in Paris and elsewhere. The movement continued to gather strength and support from broad sectors of society until it represented such a challenge to Mexico's long-ruling state party regime that the government troops were ordered to fire upon a movement rally on October 2nd, 1968, at Tlatelolco, as Ruben mentioned earlier. Hundreds of people were killed. Many others were imprisoned, forced underground, or exiled. And a generation of youth was politicized by the student movement and went on to lead an array of social movements, community organizations, and opposition political parties. Students at the nation's two leading art academies, San Carlos and La Esmeralda, produced hundreds of posters, flyers, and banners for the 1968 movement, using bold graphics to express the demand for civil liberties and democracy. Graphics produced by student movement activists exposed the authoritarian nature of the post-revolutionary corporatist regime, asserted a vision of citizenship that was invested with full civil and human rights, and re-signified much of the nationalist iconography that once helped shore up the regime's hegemony. For example, in this powerful poster created for the student movement by Adolfo Mejiac, a young man's mouth has been chained and padlocked, and Mexico's logo for the Summer Olympics appears underneath the words Libertad de Expresión. That graphic, widely reproduced and circulated in Mexico and the United States at the time, undermined the image being promoted by the Mexican and US governments of Mexico as a model of stable democracy, development, and modernization. In a move quite startling for its boldness at the time, student movement artists frequently used the iconic eagle and snake, traditional symbols of the nation's founding that appear on the national flag. They used them as symbols of repression. Take, for example, this menacing image engraved on a movement poster by an anonymous artist from La Esmeralda Art Academy. Then President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz appears as a bayonet-winged eagle hovering over a snake that seems to speak the president's words. Aquí nomás mi chicharrón truena, an idiomatic expression meaning roughly, my voice is the only one heard here. Such images were seen repeatedly by hundreds of thousands of Mexicans between July and October of 1968. They were carried on protest marches, pasted on the sides of buses, draped from public buildings, and circulated on flyers in markets throughout the capital. They worked to unmask the hegemonic regime by unfixing the meetings attributed to these symbols by the regime's political and cultural agents. Mexican citizenship had long been performed according to a script of humble, obedient clients or children protected and provided for by a benevolent corporatist state party and its president. As re-signified by movement artists, meaningful citizenship demanded that people expose and challenge authoritarian rule, which required, in part, a demystification of the symbols of the state's power and authority. Many of the artists involved in the student movement, politicized by it or both, continued their activism with the formation of political art collectives known in Mexico as the Grupos movement. At its height, the movement included more than a dozen artist collectives in Mexico City and a few others in cities like Guadalajara, which came together briefly in 1979 as the Frente Mexicano de Grupos Trabajadores de la Cultura. The grupos used artwork to support a variety of other popular movements and to focus attention on social problems such as urban poverty, repression, corruption, environmental destruction, and US imperialism. A number of the grupos also took on important mythical figures such as the Virgin of Guadalupe, a complex religious icon that managed to retain its power as a national symbol even in a self-proclaimed secular republic. The strong Marxist influence in the Grupos movement's early years and then feminist influence in later years encouraged a reading of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a sign of oppression. Marx's religion as opiate of the masses combined with feminist critiques of the Virgin as a symbol of gender inequality and sexual repression. For example, the collage mural by Grupo Taller de Arte e Ideología, shown here on the left, incorporates the Virgin into images of guerrillas, at the time a symbol commonly used to indicate the government's brutal violence, and news clips about poverty and government corruption. And in an installation piece by the Mexican collective Peyote y la Compañía, shown on the right, traditional images of the Virgin of Guadalupe, of her face, surround the naked lower torso of a male mannequin, which appears to be crawling on its knees like a pilgrim visiting the Virgin's shrine. The contradiction between public male reverence of the Virgin and private male disrespect of real-life women is suggested by a line from an Efraín Huerta poem that has been painted across the back and buttocks of the headless naked body. Quote, "He does not even have respect for the woman he loves so sweetly." Such images suggested that meaningful citizenship required freeing oneself from notions that injustices, exploitation, and inequalities of daily life were either the result of God's will or could be alleviated by appeals to the nation's patron saint. Grupo Suma's street art also drew attention to Mexico's system of social class inequality and exploitation. Suma repeatedly used the stark silhouette of a stooped male worker, a figure they referred to as el desempleado, the unemployed, and they also frequently used one of a poor street urchin. Images like these were often combined with a silhouette of a man dressed in a business suit and carrying a briefcase. Grupos like Suma claimed the city's streets as the people's space for art and protest, and there were no public commissions involved, I can assure you, thus challenging the gatekeeping role of mainstream art institutions as well as the regime's monopoly of the public square. Feminists like Maris Bustamante and Mónica Mayer used art to subvert patriarchal conceptions of Mexican womanhood and motherhood and to constitute empowered, fully sexual female subjects. They frequently collaborated with other feminist artists, writers, musicians, and performers, such as Carmen Buyosa, Liliana Felipe, Lourdes Grobet, Magali Lara, Carla Ripi, and of course the great Jesus Rodriguez, who we're going to hear from this afternoon. Mónica Mayer organized the first exhibition of work officially called Feminist Art in Mexico in 1977. That show included her then quite controversial collage, Ilusiones, shown here. A woman's face stares forward. Behind her, a parted curtain reveals enlarged photographs of a penis and a vagina. Text in the lower right reads, "Sometimes my own feelings and fantasies frighten me." Mayer curated another controversial exhibition in the early 1980s titled Silences, Virgins, and Other Feminist Themes. Images of the Virgin Mary appeared alongside swastikas, phalluses, masturbating women, and the word rape. In 1982, in a performance piece called Caliente Caliente, Maris Bustamante wore a fake penis on her nose while deconstructing Freud's theory of penis envy. A penis-nosed mask was available under the seat of each audience member, and the audience was encouraged to join in the fun of deflating patriarchal icons. Working together, Bustamante and Mayer pioneered the formation of feminist art collectives in 1983 when they organized Polvo de Gallina Negra, Black Hen's Power. For 10 years, they staged what they termed montajes de momentos plásticos, montages of visual moments, on a wide variety of women's issues ranging from the stereotypes of motherhood to rape and abortion. Since the emergence of Mexico's homosexual liberation movement in the late 1970s, LGBT activists have worked to transform a cultural politics of national identity that rested discursively on patriarchal constructs of heterosexism, machismo, and rigid binaries of gender and sexuality. Visual artwork produced in the context of Mexico's LGBT movements helped to shape new discourses and imagine new subjects constituted around the intersections of gender, sexuality, and national identity. In 1987, a major exhibition of artwork by gays, lesbians, and allied supporters, since 1987, a major exhibition of work by those folks, has been mounted each year in the Museo del Chopo in Mexico City as part of the annual LGBT Pride celebration. Art historian Jorge Alberto Manrique described the annual El Chopo exhibitions as sites of, quote, solidarity with the cause of a persecuted, assaulted, and wounded minority. In the assessment of the late Carlos Monsiváis, the annual Pride activities, quote, constituted for civil society critical proof of the way in which alternative spaces have contributed to the diversity and the democratization of Mexican life. So over the past few years, I've organized an archive of 600 images produced by LGBT and allied artists in Mexico. And I've been working with those images on a book and exhibition project called Queerly Mexican. Unfortunately, we don't have time to look at more than about 3 of the amazing images in that archive today, but I'll give you a little taste. The visual culture of the modern Mexican nation-state provided fertile ground for gay male artists intent on decoupling Mexicanidad from notions of proudly heterosexual, hypermasculine machismo. Some, such as Froilán Ruiz, emphasize the homophobic violence embedded in national symbols. In Ruiz's surrealistic Los Amorosos y Morir en México, The Loving Ones and to Die in Mexico from 1993, the head of a dark-skinned, mustachioed, smiling man, presumably one of the loving ones, floats in the top left corner of the sky. To the right, the name Roberto, written in cursive letters, glows like a neon sign. Does the name belong to the disembodied head or to his departed amoroso? What appears to be an explosion of blood erupts from the center of the image and little red drops dot the canvas. Fragile stalks of a pussy willow-like plant rise from a watery surface that covers the lower third of the painting. One of the stalks is broken, and small human hearts seem to be embossed on some of the blossoms. A blood-stained Mexican flag hangs from a string, rather like a flag of surrender, in the foreground. For a gay man in love, the painting suggests, to die in Mexico in the 1990s was likely to be an experience marked by the violence of homophobia and AIDS. Can the fragile pussy willows and their hearts avoid such death? Is the Mexican flag, usually a symbol of national patriotism, pride, and unity, surrendering in shame before such horror? The approach taken by other artists was to queer the nation's symbols. In a tableau created in 1993 by photographer Adolfo Pérez Butrón, early 20th century revolutionary hero Emiliano Zapata is represented as an object of desire for men and women alike. Standing in front of what appears to be the mural of the Aztec's iconic plumed serpent, Zapata wears a bandolier that instead of bullets carries foil packets of condoms, the weapon of choice in the fight against AIDS. He's embraced affectionately by a woman on his left and a man on his right. His imagined lovers are dressed in the traditional white clothing of the campesinos who joined Zapata's revolutionary army. Each wears a garland of garlic, a common ingredient in the recipes of folk medicine, and here perhaps imagined protection against HIV. Pérez Butrón reproduces the standard image of Zapata as a smoldering, virile macho. But this Zapata is also bisexual, and ever the revolutionary leader prepared to protect his sexual partners by using condoms. In a final example, from 1977 into the early 2000s, photographer and lesbian activist Yolanda Andrade captured images of the streets of Mexico City, including many LGBT people like the ones seen here. Andrade's photographs provided the public with an extensive series of unsensationalized portraits of the great diversity of sexualities and genders that occupy the city's streets. Cumulatively, then, over the 4 decades since 1968, the wide circulation of these counter-hegemonic visual discourses produced by artists actively engaged in social movements has contributed to the constitution and mobilization of new social subjects and to the still incomplete democratization of political and cultural life in Mexico City. The artwork and the activists who created it have helped the city's residents imagine and perform diverse new ways of being Mexican, with one common denominator being their passionate public engagement in demands for social justice, equality, and participatory democratic governance. Evidence of this can be seen in the city's recent mass mobilizations, such as the hashtag Yo Soy 132 insurgency in 2012, and this year's ongoing protests around the 43 student teachers from Ayotzinapa. Building upon, but expanding and in some ways deepening the legacy of the students, the grupos, the feminists, and the LGBT movements, these recent mobilizations have been characterized by an effervescent display of diversity, a passionate demand for social justice, a participatory democracy, and the wildly creative participation of activist artists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward, for this wonderful presentation. Now we have Daniel Hernandez. He's our last panelist. Daniel Hernandez is a journalist, author, editor, and on-camera host and producer based in Mexico City. He was born in 1980 in San Diego and studied English literature on Regents and Chancellor's Scholarship at the University of California, Berkeley. He served 1 year as an editor-in-chief and president of the Daily California. He is the author of Down and Delirious in Mexico City. Daniel has been Mexico Bureau Chief for Vice News after serving for a year as editor of Vice, Mexico Print Magazine. He writes for Vice in English and Spanish and has reported from Chile, Peru, Colombia, Argentina, in much of Mexico and across most of Southern California. Previously, he worked in the Mexico City Bureau of the Los Angeles Times, where he covered breaking news and wrote news and features for the LA Times printed edition in News and Arts. He has also been a staff writer in the Los Angeles Times in LA, on the Downtown Metro desk at LA Weekly. Daniel has been a contributor to Gato Pardo magazine in Mexico, Art in American magazine, and occasionally on Latino USA, and All Things Considered. Daniel will be presenting today a talk entitled Me Encanta la Ciudad, The Perils of a More User-Friendly Mexico City. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for this invitation and for all the wonderful panelists and speakers so far today. I want to start off by saying that my work as a journalist in Mexico, I spend most of my time chasing really awful headlines and investigating cases that reflect the terrible tragedy that Mexico is facing today. It's part of my work at Vice News, and Mexico, unfortunately, continues to be hammered by corruption and organized crime backed by U.S. policies, and people have nowhere really to turn. So this year, in the past year, I've covered the Ayotzinapa case, myself and the Vice News crew down in Mexico. We've also covered some of the autodefensas in Guerrero, Michoacan, and Chapo's escape from prison, and so on. But in the midst of all that, I live in Mexico City, and Mexico City has really fueled and inspired my work and inspired my reporting and my writing. My practice has always been to sort of bound the lines between cultural reporting, arts reporting, food reporting, and politics in Mexico. And the environment in Mexico City is one that I've really been unable to adequately describe despite all my years there. and unable to replicate or to see replicated anywhere else. And I know that it is a sensation that is shared by many people who must make it happen and make it work in this stew of 20 million competitors. It's part of the EFE's, I believe, character as a magnet for dreamers and optimists of every sort, from the exiles of wars in Europe and Central and South America in the 20th century, to visionaries and revolutionaries, some of whom have already been mentioned, such as Che Guevara, Leonora Carrington, Modotti, Trotsky, and M.N. Roy, an Indian revolutionary theorist who I'll mention again in a bit. So I first came to Mexico City in 2002, in what you might call its post-90s period. And I remember my first impressions very distinctly. The slow-cooked quality of the air and spaces. The way certain ways of dressing or being from past decades have never really gone out of style on the street. I remember being struck by seeing afros and bell-bottoms in 2002, as if nothing had changed. The abundance of tastes, smells, music, and clashes of light. And I think I saw a lot of that reflected in some of the work that we saw earlier during Tatiana's presentation. Back then, in the first days and weeks of living there, Mexico City felt much farther than the 3 or 4 hour flight that it really is. It was crowded, noisy, toxic. The city seemed to be rocking alone at sea, far away, with lost or buried treasures gathering dust and rain. It also seemed full of hope and promise and possibility. It was a place where you could become anything you wanted or could disappear into the luxury of anonymity, where people expressed themselves liberally, violently, helplessly, despite the odds. That energy, again, is also what draws people, and it has drawn people to the EFE, the Distrito Federal, for generations and generations. In this image here, we see 2 guys dancing some cumbias in Tepito. So what I wanted to address today is that 13 years later, my fear is that that sensation is a little under threat, that sense of liberty and total freedom. And that's what I wanted to address today with the phrase, me encanta la ciudad. Me encanta la ciudad means the city enchants me. But it's more of a colloquial use of the word encanta, meaning sort of like, I find it so cool, or this is so neat. The phrase was used for a while by Mexico City's municipal government in pink letters on billboards when it began seeking to promote this idea of the capital of Mexico as a friendly playground for urban adventurers. It was not an isolated catchphrase. Everywhere you turned, in fact, Mexico City by around 2005 and 2006 was gradually becoming unnervingly self-aware. Its official version of itself became more self-referential, coated in the sheen of propaganda meant to convince you that you were at the best possible place at the best possible time. Mexico City, in short, became a brand, a user-friendly place. These are some kids at a concert in San Salvador Atenco, meant to raise funds for political prisoners after the 2006 uprising there in Atenco over the airport that they wanted to place. So, Me encanta la ciudad was used and, the foundations set for this phenomenon started in the term of the former mayor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. López Obrador formed an alliance with telecom mogul Carlos Slim to clean out the historic core of the city of its street vendors and to renovate dozens of colonial and Art Deco buildings for reuse and for the new residents. And as Ruben noted, this was a radical shift for the Centro Histórico, since it was all but abandoned in the eyes of development after the devastating 1985 quake. That, as you can imagine, set off a chain reaction of events that, taken as a whole, could be described, if you dare, as a process of gentrification. The inevitable, maybe, side effects of an unofficial effort to to spruce up a modern world city and to prep it for investment in a free market global economy. This process really blasted off in the term of Mayor Marcelo Ebrard and sort of settled into a kind of uninspired autopilot in the current term of Mayor Miguel Ángel Mancera, the three of them belonging to the officially opposition PRD, Party of the Democratic Revolution, which emerged, if you're not aware, as a schism with the PRI precisely after the '85 quake and the 1988 stolen presidential election. This is C'est Moi. These are just some photos that I've gathered over the years, and some of them have appeared in my book, Down and Delirious in Mexico City. C'est Moi is a transgender socialite and good friend. In cultural and practical terms, the DF's changes were aided and accelerated by the speed of information afforded by the rapidly expanding use of internet in Mexico, the connectivity and self-absorbing hall of mirrors generated by a proliferation of smartphones and app use. In 2002, when I first went to Mexico City, it was very rare to see a cell phone on the streets. And also influenced in part with the help of transnational cross-migration as Mexicans come to the United States, return to Mexico, sometimes splitting their families, sometimes reuniting their families, and by the overwhelming reach of United States consumer culture. This world where constant recognition and instant gratification are always primary concerns. The most significant improvements to the city's daily way of life were major. The Metrobus dedicated bus lane system, for some of you might be familiar with it, was started by López Obrador and expanded by Marcelo Ebrard. The expansion of the Ecobici shared bicycle program, which really became a model for other cities in the United States and elsewhere, and the closure of major avenues for biking and track and field on Sundays, etc., all standard new urbanism stuff, and also along with the increased overall focus among city bureaucrats to make the city more livable, more user-friendly, as if the city itself were an app. And then other things started happening. Rents rose in Condesa, then in Roma, then in Centro, where I lived for many years and wrote and worked, then just about everywhere else in a more or less cohesive central node of the city. Real estate speculation and subsidies for developers crept into other areas of the city in a logical geographical spiral. San Miguel Chapultepec, Escandón, San Rafael, La Colonia Juárez, Santa María la Ribera, and now even Doctores, a barrio directly adjacent to Roma and until recently stereotyped as a node of poverty and crime. These are all places now that are very popular on Airbnb. So economic development zones became the new strategy to spruce up town, and everything gradually, it seemed, got nice. But there is nothing more gentrifying, I think, than complaining about gentrification. So I'm not going to bemoan the good old days, because my good old days are always going to be someone's everything has changed period. I think gentrification as a phenomenon belongs in broader cycles of urban economies and macroeconomies and respond to local contexts and challenges. And in the US, urban migration and displacement is occurring, I would say, in the context of so-called post-racial thinking in politics or in the battle over this way of looking at gentrification and displacement, but it's not the same in Mexico. People are not pushed out so violently in the DF as they are in some US cities in classic US-style gentrification. But more than that, in some ways, the old souls of the colonias, I think, resist. Mexico City as an urban space is almost too old and too tied to the soggy ground to be uprooted with such brute force as has happened in some sections of major US cities now, or to weather the sort of lame comparisons that certain visitors make when they come to the DF, like where's the new Williamsburg, or what is the DF's Echo Park. So the argument here might even be positive, right? See, Mexico City can improve the basic quality of life of its residents and also retain its character and flavor, even if a Carlos Slim mega development goes up next to an old mercado. The old mercado is always going to be there, right? So it will not suffer the terrifying consequences of total annihilation style consumer capitalism. So what's not to like? I think these changes, though, remain for the most part successful, yes, but cosmetic operations that improve certain aspects of life in Mexico City, but overall mask or hide the underlying problems that the vast majority of the city's population still confronts. Poverty, vast inequality, the precariousness of basic services such as water and electricity, unchecked petty crime, rampant corruption, and the abuse and repression at the hands of the authorities, as we see in this image from just a regular old protest outside of the headquarters of the PRI, of the PRI. And as these problems have largely festered unattended, the constant drumbeat declaring Mexico City as a booming land of riches for optimists of every sort creates a dissonance with the reality on the ground. The reality is life in Mexico City is very tough. It is defined by hazards and by risk, by a lack of basic security for most residents who can't afford personal bodyguards, and a lack of basic services for millions who live outside of the limelight of the city's spruced up core. A recent survey by INEGI, the official nonpartisan statistics institute, found that 72% of Mexicans feel unsafe in their communities. And in 2014, 15,121 people were mugged with violence in the DF. So you can still get held up on the street in Mexico City in daylight, and the police will often make matters worse for you. Your water or power will cut out unexpectedly, and authorities will have no answer for you for hours or even days. Daily, beggars and street vendors ask for a coin from diners at the fanciest sidewalk tables, a reminder of the entrenched inequality that defines life here for millions. Even today, unfortunately, you hear constantly from ordinary Chilangos about their brief brush with death, either at the barrel of a gun during a mugging or in a human sandwich during rush hour in DF's over-impacted subway system where 4.5 million people use it daily. So I think that leads people to respond with incredible examples of self-expression, such as these friends outside El Chopo, the alternative youth subculture street market that has survived for 35 years near the Chopo Museum and near the Vasconcelos Library. I think they're cyberpunk. Corruption, a lack of long-term care for planning of the city's infrastructure, and a total failure of the public safety apparatus means that life in the DF today is just about as tough and precarious, I think, as it was 20 years ago. Worse, it seems to me that these problems have been left to rot, while the PR onslaught muscles out any room for the necessary discussion of radically needed shifts or rethinking of how the city works and how it responds to its problems. Some people say that's the charm, the incredible contrast, anything can happen. Well, I think that's an incredibly privileged position from which to make any kind of argument. That would never be the sort of argument made by someone who makes under 8,000 pesos a month in a professional job, deals with abusive employers, or even with people who work on the street and answer to organized crime dons and bosses and really have no safety net. So Mexico City, yes, has never been more livable and more inviting to foreigners, but long simmering social and security problems continue to make it an inherently risky place for the millions who do not have the privileges that accompany a foreign passport or even a foreign visage in Mexico. This is a scene in the Tepito market. So, let me just run through a couple of more of these photos. Here is a home after flooding that happens during every rainy season at Rio de los Remedios on the northern edge of the core of the city. we were the only reporters who showed up there, and people's homes were flooded up to 5 feet up, and they received no government help, no government aid. And that actually happened during Election Day in the Estado de Mexico, in which the PRI was reelected to the governorship with Eruviel Avila. Oh, that was about all they got. Each household got a plastic bag with chips and gamesa cookies and some rolls of toilet paper, I think. This is a scene inside Nesa, a sculpture, I believe, by Sebastián, of the coyote, the official insignia of Ciudad Nesa. Now, of course, Nesa has gone from being this rundown, completely destitute, unplanned suburb into a place where you find Burger Kings, Veeps, and Walmarts. Yet crime is still a major problem there. This is a photograph I took of a program that was started in Iztapalapa, the most populous and also most crime-affected delegación borough of Mexico City. The city did a program called Por tu Familia, Desarme Voluntario. For your family, voluntary disarmament. And basically anyone could come and bring any kind of weapon, firearm, bullets, or other paraphernalia, and in exchange for a tablet or for a despensa, which is the typical clientist box of food for a household, for a family. So you see here pistols, rifles, and some semi-automatic handguns. And they eventually expanded this program to all of the delegaciones, and thousands of weapons were turned in. This is an image at the Zócalo during the daily traditional lowering of the Mexican flag. This is a shot that I took during coverage of one of the demonstrations of the Yo Soy 132, popular street insurgency, as you had mentioned, Ed, before the election of Enrique Peña Nieto in July 2012. And this, unfortunately, is another protest at the same spot. This happened this is still Yo Soy 132. But recently, another image that I meant to show here was protests held for Rubén Espinosa and Nadia Vera, journalists and activists who were killed in Mexico City in the middle-class Narvarte neighborhood, July 31st of this year. They had been both activists and, journalists and activists in the state of Veracruz, had fled Veracruz due to security threats and were killed in what the police initially are still calling a random armed robbery in which extreme violence was used against them. And this is in the suburb of Chalco, to the east of the city, east of the airport. Incredibly poor part of the metropolis. Here is a group of workers looking for a missing woman, victim of a femicide. And we were there covering it for Vice News. They found a human skull while we were there, completely unreported and unseen crimes. So Mexico City has become more livable and more inviting, yes, but should we keep absorbing more privileged migrants for the sake of charm, for the sake of kind of the creative cultural capital that exists, to sort of feed this horrible and bankrupt phrase, the Berlin of Latin America? I'm not sure, but I find hope, I think, in some of the models. This is the Rubén Espinosa protest, sorry. The models of people who've come before us. I think of M.N. Roy, the radical South Asian anti-colonial intellectual who flourished in Mexico City. Very little is known about him. I myself know very little about him. But apparently he helped influence the Mexican Revolution. He founded a school of thought he dubbed radical humanism and was inspired by the FS dissonance and contrast from 100 years ago. But even M.N. Roy's legacy is under threat. In some way, in this new polished pin-up Mexico City, today there is no major monument or academic or cultural institution in DF named after him that I know of. Instead, there is a nightclub in Roma called Roy. And Semois, actually, the figure you saw earlier, was the doorkeeper. She was the one who would check you out and determine whether you fit the bill to enter the club. And I'm certain that most of the people who go to this space have no idea what the root of the name of this antro is. And I recently came across a narrative comic. I'll just skip to that there. A narrative comic by Krish Raghav, a Beijing-based illustrator, who noted dryly in a piece published in National Geographic that if M.N. Roy attempted to enter the club M.N. Roy today, he would likely not be allowed inside. And so maybe in that moment, this revolutionary would have a stir of a thought and maybe still say, "Me encanta la ciudad," right, because of these contrasts. But that's a thought that I wanted to leave you with now. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Daniel, for this wonderful trip to Mexico City. And now we will have Yvonne Del Valle, who will be our discussant. She will discuss for 10 minutes the three presentations, and then the presenters could answer back in the following 5 minutes. So Yvonne is an associate professor of colonial studies. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley in 2004, and before returning to the Bay Area in 2009, she taught at the University of Michigan. Her research and teaching make connections between the past and the present, which try to show the relevance of the colonial period for an understanding of contemporary times. She was co-director of the Berkeley research group Mexico and the Rule of Law. She has written a book and a series of articles on the Jesuits and particularly influential political religious order, their modernization, and the expression of the Spanish Empire. She is currently working on 2 projects, one on the drainage of the lakes of Mexico City, and the other on the role of colonization of Spanish America from the 15th century onward in the development of new epistemologies and political theories. So welcome, Yvonne.
Good morning, everyone, and my comments are going to be shorter than 10 minutes, hopefully, because I'm sure that you have lots of questions for the presenters. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to read and comment on these great papers that look at 3 moments in the history of the city: the post-revolutionary period, the aftermath of 1968, and our very present, to demonstrate how art, understood broadly from poetry to the art of walking around that Daniel, in a way, is hinting at, so how this art enters the everyday construction of the great monster. And I say this with love, but Mexico City is a monster, great monster that Mexico City is. No? So through her analysis of the relationship between Fermín Revueltas and Maple Sarce, and between Jean Charlot and Maple Sarce, Tatiana Flores underscores the impossibility of creating a viable synthesis between tradition and modernity, which, as we know, was the dream of the post-revolutionary cultural project. The more terrestrial forces supposedly coming from the real Mexico in the women that, according to Charlot, resembled the Virgin of Guadalupe, continued to be opposed to the more vertical and concrete-made buildings of Maple Sarce's urban fantasy. In spite of this difference in perspective, what is very interesting to me is the fact that there was an open debate, a critical yet friendly dialogue between positions that at times came close to each other. No? And we see this in Maple Sarce, Urbe, no? And as Tatiana said, they were mutually supportive, these 2 areas. But in any case, whether they agreed or not, this debate left many traces that are available for us to see, and especially now that Tatiana has done the work for us, no? But I'm wondering here about the regimes of visibility, no? And I'm also thinking about what Rubén Gallo said about concealment, no? And what's there in the open for everyone to see or not. So Edward McCaughan's paper reminded me in turn of Serge Krusinski's famous and polemical book, Images at War, Mexico from Columbus to Blade Runner, a book in which images are the terrain where all important struggles are decided. The anthropologist Néstor García Canclini would agree with this assessment, since for him the creation of what he calls Mexico's cultural profile was precisely a visual operation. Edward's paper discusses images in which not only culture, but also politics and subjectivity are contested. One of them, the image of Díaz Ordaz as the iconic eagle representing the origins of the country, reminds us of moments in which symbols of cohesion acquired a threatening meaning. Nevertheless, this image in particular, like most of the ones that Edward showed us, does not collapse when facing the threat, but on the contrary, works to corrode it. Since these images, the images that Edward presents us address identity and citizenship, they suggest that the latter is achieved not through, and this was Edward's words, not through humble obedience, but on the contrary, through dissent, even around issues that are supposed to be very Mexican, such as some ideas on masculinity. Oddly then, in Ed's and Tatiana's papers, opposition sometimes, and I know that this is not always the case, but sometimes emerges from state institutions. La Esmeralda, Academia de San Carlos in one case, and the committee in charge of inviting Rafael Lozano Hemmer to the Turn of the Millennium event in the other are all state institutions. And even if in the second case, the committee members could not have known that the installation might be read as a somber reflection on surveillance, not what Tatiana is doing, they were still the ones who decided which artists to include. And if one follows the trajectory of Lozano Hemmer, this type of reading that Tatiana gives us, it's very possible, it's plausible. So what were they doing, inviting him to do something at the Zócalo, no? And knowing that people like Tatiana are going to be interpreting this in ways that are not very in keeping with the official discourse. Therefore, if I were to ask a question of Ed and Tatiana, I'd ask about the role of public institutions in the construction of alternatives that, as you show, appear openly in the very surface of the city, in very visible debates. And I think that all the images that the three of them presented show this, that the debate is very open, very raw, very out there. So in the first two papers, we were invited to think about questions such as who owns symbols, images, who can create new ones, who has the right to change their meaning. Is, for example, the Virgin of Guadalupe better represented by Charlotte's solemn women or by the more playful and ironic image of the collective Taller de Arte in Peyote y Compañía? No? Which Virgen de Guadalupe do we keep? No? Which one is the real one? Or what is a legitimate use of technology, surveillance, or the artistic exposure of surveillance? What these papers show then is a very vibrant city in which everything seems to be, in a way, undecided, unresolved, alive. The question is then, what does this mean? And this trail of visual and written signs brings me to Daniel Hernandez's paper. As someone who, like our presenters, is fascinated by Mexico City, I take Daniel's paper as an invitation to wonder, question where this fascination lies. Is it something tangible, intangible, visual, not visual, something excessively sensorial, something that overwhelms us every time we're there? Two concepts that Daniel uses gives us a glimpse, I think. And one of the concepts that I was going to use, he didn't mention this word, or I don't think I heard that he used a gritty core, no, and the gritty core in his paper, but he didn't mention it. But I'll mention it anyway. So that word, and toxic, no, because Mexico City is that too. It's toxic. So in a book in which he discusses the need to create a contract with nature, not a social contract, which is already given, philosopher Michel Serres imagines that this contract must embrace certain dangers. And he says if you want to recover nature or the nature within us, some of the results are not going to be very pleasant. Without accepting his idea that these dangers have been expelled in what he calls first world countries, I quote what he says about places that we can imagine are like the Mexico City Daniel presents us with, places in which tranquility is chased off by somehow darker meanings. And this is the quote from Serres. Everyone considers these worlds dangerous. But what they actually call for is simple presence, because there one must respond at every point and in real time to the active attention of that. One must be as alert and as present as it is in order to reply to a tit for tat. That makes you very supple, very intelligent, that keeps you awake. Diligence against negligence. And of course, when I say this, I don't want to fall into what he says, the privilege, talking about what is beautiful about Mexico City, and it's also part of that danger, no? And I don't want to think about all the things that were hinted here at about state violence or corruption, because even without that, a city of 22 million people that are so diverse, it's still a strange place, no? And yes, one needs to be alert when walking around Mexico City, and I don't mean because of your wallet. It's just that there's this poem by Nicolás Guillén, no, that he's not referring to Mexico City, but where he says, "La calle es un gran río de gente," and when we are in Mexico, the street, it's a great river, no, and obviously when you're in Mexico, sometimes you just have to go because you can't not stop in certain streets. No, they take you there. No. So yes, one needs to be alert when walking around Mexico City, because it is a place, Daniel suggests, that has never been, nor will it be, fully domesticated and normalized. The mercados will survive there in the midst of gentrification. Like what Ruben was saying, this new taller in the ruins of Pani, it's being built without permits, no? And it's right there. No, it's not domesticated. And it's true, since the colonial period, what elites have considered the most unsavory elements of the city are periodically sent away, only to return with greater force a few years later. But then the question is, and it doesn't seem like this is the end, but I'm ending with this. No, the question is, what is it that we like and admire about Mexico City, since we recognize that part of its allure is precisely its toxic nature, and the multiple social conflicts and the artistic debates that are there for anyone to see. So in a question, it's also, what is it about us that we're drawn also to something that is still very raw, no? And that's it. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. So please feel free to respond to the discussion.
Thank you. I totally agree that it does raise a question about what's crazy about us to be so drawn to this toxic place. And that's why, despite my critiques, I think that I always admire someone who decides that they must make Mexico City their home, or who decides that they must take the risk and take on the hazards and open themselves up to what the city can give to them, and also what they can give. And I think that is sort of the fundamental tarea, the task. Mexico City has this way of taxing you if you don't treat it with the respect, or with the respect of it for its dangers. And so that's what I always tell people, that there's always going to be this cosmic play between dark and light and good and evil in Mexico City, and you see it literally on the streets, such as in that drawing, the Charlot drawing of the bourgeois mother and child, and the normal mother and child. You know, you see those contrasts daily on the street, and if you don't sort of recognize and respect their power and their risk, it could eat you up. It could gobble you up. And there are just so many cases. Sometimes they're so minor, such as, you know, Roma and Condesa are such beautiful neighborhoods, and they're so rich, you know, but I know tons of people who've gotten mugged in those neighborhoods, and yet you might never, ever, ever get messed with or ever even deal with any of that kind of situation in a neighborhood such as Doctores, which I mentioned, which has this reputation, but is actually quite, you know, normal and safe and calm. So those are the contrasts that draw people and have drawn some of the people whose work we saw now, and also inspire so many people's work. And I just think that they need to be sort of, you know, respected for the power that exists there, you know.
In my case, I think that I started going to Mexico City in my 20s for research, and at that point, I realized that I never felt more alive in my life than the summer of 1999 was my first research trip on this topic. And so I identified so much with Maple Sarce's exuberance. He was not from Mexico City either. He was from Veracruz. And I think that part of what's going on in his manifesto is that sort of being in a new site that is not familiar, and that it just presents so many opportunities. And over the years, I have suffered the toxicity. I turned in my manuscript in April 2012 on a Monday, and on Friday I went in for sinus surgery because I caught some chronic sinusitis that has actually never left me. And so I have this sort of post-nasal drip that I attribute to Mexico City. And I went there pregnant in 2013, and I was so sort of nervous about what was, you know, what I could eat and what, you know, making sure the baby was going to be okay. But at the same time, it really is just so energizing. And those debates and artistic dialogues that I describe, I haven't found them anywhere else. I study Latin American modernisms comparatively. And that kind of engagement with the art, with representation, with the kinds of things that I'm looking at from the 1920s, is just something that is a model from Mexico that other countries look to, but that I haven't quite found it in the same way in any other Latin American country. So.
Well, you know, toxic is also associated with the word intoxicating. And, you know, for me, the appeal of Mexico City is so totally tied up with my own personal history as well as my scholarship and politics that it's, you know, I find it a constant source of optimism, which seems very strange because it is so fucked up. But you know, it's the optimism that comes from a community that never stops resisting. I mean, people don't just shrug and give up and say, "Well, that's it. That's right." They continue, and you know, my sort of political and intellectual coming of age all happened very closely associated with Mexico City in the early '70s, and we have many, many friends there now over the years, close friends, all of whom are, you know, political activists or artists, and that provides for their lives, their examples, their way of living their lives, their way of incorporating their personal life with their politics and their art and their scholarship provides for me a source of inspiration that I don't find so readily here. So I would also just a little confessional, you know, I think my paper is overly optimistic, but that's also sort of intentional. and I'm often the voice of optimism in these public forums, because otherwise, you know, you've got to find it where you can find it. And so I would prefer to emphasize that resistance and the creativity than the death and destruction, even though I know they both exist together.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions and answers. I would like to invite Ruben to join us here because he didn't have time for questions, and I'm sure you will also like to talk to him.
There's one, I want to change this image real quick.
Okay.
That's just a painting that I saw once actually at El Chopo by a Guadalajara-based painter named Antonio Luquin. And I was very struck by it and its depiction of this Mexican mutating megalopolis.
So please.
Thank you. I have a question for Ruben, but it may be answered by others as well. I was particularly struck by this juxtaposition of Havana and Mexico City. And you establish it through this contrast between a Havana that flaunts its ruins and a Mexico City that seeks unsuccessfully to conceal them. But I was wondering if one might also pursue the analogy on the basis of I think perhaps a broader claim that I think you could flesh out, which is about the convergence of capitalist modernization and socialist modernization within the global South. And that it is precisely, unexpectedly perhaps, when you consider the differences in terms of state formation and political economy, that something like the visibility of ruin and a kind of palimpsest of ruins is a kind of marker of the failed or uneven modernization of the megalopolises of the global South. So I'm wondering where to go with this idea, because on the one hand, what you've done is given us a kind of visual iconography of the ruin and attempted to historicize it with respect to the moment in which it emerges as ruined. But how much further can we go with this analogy? Because on the surface, it doesn't seem entirely convincing, and yet I think there's a deeper logic to it which actually points to unexpected convergences between 20th century socialism and 20th century capitalism.
Yes, you know, thank you for that question, Harsh. I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of what I find extremely interesting in Havana and in Cuba in general, and is that when you go to Havana, you see the end of a system. You know, it's very clear that this is socialism in its last gasps, or basically what remains of a certain kind of a socialist experiment that is really agonizing. But it's still there, you know, especially if you're Cuban and you make Cuban pesos and you have to shop with the ration card that you get. And, you know, all the rest of the very glamorous Havana. You probably saw Vanity Fair. It has Rihanna on the cover. It says Rihanna in Havana. And there's that very glitzy, you know, very glamorous Cuba that's emerging, but for a lot of Cubans, you know, that's a mirage. You know, that's something that you would see from the sidelines. So, you know, the reality of the country is that you have this declining, agonizing socialism, and at the same time, the birth of something new, but no one knows what that is, and no one knows in which direction it's going to go. And it's actually a very exciting space to inhabit and a very exciting historical moment to live in, because it creates an interstice where you get these very strange spaces, situations, ways of living in the world that would never be possible either in a socialist system or in a fully developed capitalist economy. But in the interstice between the two, you can have them. For instance, you know, I'll just give you one example that in some cases resonates with something that you could have seen in Mexico City at some time. You know, there were, as you know, homosexuality in Cuba after the revolution was you know, frowned upon. There were concentration camps for gay men at some point in the 70s. There was a period in the 90s where it was tolerated, and there were these underground gay parties. Now, because of the work of Mariela Castro, who's Raúl's daughter, there was a state institutional decision to open gay bars and to create gay bars. So, you know, that was great. Except the funny thing is that you now have gay bars in Havana, but they're state-owned. And when you go there, you know, you see this sort of wildlife that you would never see in San Francisco or LA or New York. You know, that's dead. You know, when you go to Havana to a gay bar, you know, this is really alive. It's wild. You know, you see everything from street prostitution that has come into the bar to the best drag shows I'd ever seen. But this is all within the frame of a state-owned bar, you know, where you have these servers with little black bow ties that are incredibly bureaucratic, and you know they're functionaries, you know, funcionarios. So they actually serve you just like they would in a state-owned cafeteria. So you know that's not going to last. And to go back to Mexico City, you know, that's, you know, I think I would agree with like Daniel. You know, I'm incredibly nostalgic, even though. There's something gentrifying about being nostalgic, but you know, very nostalgic for a certain Mexico City that doesn't exist anymore, which for me is the 90s. You know, for you it's 2002, and I think part of what I liked about Mexico City then was that, just like Havana today, it was the end of something and the beginning of something new. And at that point, no one really knew what it was. You know, it was. There was no sense that it would go towards this neoliberal, globalized economy and network of cities. But, you know, Mexico also flirted with socialism, you know, in the 70s, you know, especially our presidents Echeverría and López Portillo, you know, they were very attentive to Cuba. Cuba was a model. And there were many aspects to Mexico that came from an effort to have a state-directed economy, or at least a mixed economy. So that created actually situations where, when I go to Cuba, you know, I really remember the Mexico City of my childhood, or the Mexico of my childhood. You know, these sort of poorly run socialist stores with long lines and strategies of resistance of waiting around them. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that there's actually a economic dimension, a political dimension, and a model of state transformation that's behind what I call the ruins and the way ruins work in both countries.
Next question. Angela?
I was curious about the squatter settlements, and I don't know, I'm tempted to ask some of the other speakers to answer to that, but how is it that you have encountered the squatter settlements and the kinds of maybe rules and social systems that exist there?
Well, they're still there. I mean, I think that there was that big growth period, right, when Mexico City was growing by, what was the number was like 2,000 people a day, you know, during the big expansion during the Mexican moment. But as I mentioned, I think Nesa is a really important example, because Nesa was completely unplanned. It grew in this grid formation, expanding from the edges of the Distrito Federal. And it still has this reputation to people who don't leave the core of the city as, oh, Nesa's bad, Nesa's dangerous, don't go there, don't ever go there. But I actually find it to be the most welcoming part of the sprawl that I've ever, you know, reported in or visited friends in. And it has become this stable middle-class area, and yet there's still some people still get around on burros. Trash collection still happens with burros. A lot of people still suffer, you know, the crime issue, the services issue, and I think that's really important, because it's one of those quality of life things that us in first world environments like this take completely for granted. But for a lot of people, it is still a question of when and how they will have water that day. And we're talking about a city that is so wealthy, and there's so much capital there, and there's been so much effort to kind of give it this polished pin-up face. And yet those issues really remain, and there's no real effort or push to address them. And I think that for you know, working class people who have jobs and who have to get to the city every day. And if they raise the metro from 2 pesos to 5 over 6 years, I think it was, when you add up those 3 pesos per week, per ride, per month, per year, it is a huge, huge impact on people. You know, so if you have to use some of those pesos to pay a bribe of even 50 pesos, that's taking away, you know, those subway rides and those pasajes, you know. So I think it's important to keep in mind for everyone who's ever lived in Mexico City or been to Mexico City or plans on going that every single peso counts for millions and millions of people. So there is this tension and this stress that exists below the surface. And if someone has to pay a bribe or pay some kind of a fee, or if you get robbed, or if someone pickpockets you on the subway and you lose just 100 pesos, that is like, that's going to change your life. So those kinds of dramas and daily struggles that occur, I think, really add to this stew and the sensation of, you know, this is tense, you know. But I think the squatter settlements have really, a lot of them have become normalized and become part of the overall sprawl.
Yeah, and some of them are highly organized.
Yeah.
You can probably help me remember the name of this one. It's a long name, but it's the Francisco Villa something. Occupied buildings and basically created their own, you know, police security forces. Don't let the police in. They've connected the, you know, lines. They steal the electricity. Whenever the officials come and cut it, they just reconnect it, they steal the water, and they're now highly organized. They've built their own houses. I mean, I think that's an unusual example, but it is at a different level of squatter community, a very, very highly organized, functional place, yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Oh.
Hi, I'm a Mexican artist, and I'm extremely interested in, Edward, your presentation, and I think it's extremely optimistic. But I feel there's like an already nostalgia in Mexico that even in any attempt to make a political change, I was part of Yo Soy 132, and I think even from then we knew it wouldn't work. Even when in the making, there were a great number of reunions between older artists that were like trying to understand what we were up to, and their feeling was like, you will never make it. And I don't know if we can still be optimistic at this point. I don't know if that's a valuable political move. I want to, though, but I'm not sure. And I think nostalgia, other than the gentrifying, it's kind of necessary in the Mexican understanding of the last years. I don't know if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, quickly, because I know we're almost out of time. Jesus, did you want to respond to that? No? I was just... Quickly, you know, I think when you say even at the time, in the midst of the movement, you knew it wouldn't work, but that partly depends on what making it work means. And if the goal of making it work is creating some yet another alternative opposition political party, probably not going to work. If making it work is, can we renew and build new creative human relationships and a new sense of community and find other ways of working together and of operationalizing power in different ways, then I think there's reason to be hopeful. I think as human beings we can continue to recreate ways of practicing human relations. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I can give you much to be hopeful about. But, yeah.
Solo un comentario, tal vez Rubén me puedes ayudar a traducir, que me llamó mucho la atención tu ponencia porque frente a la casa de Leonora Carrington en la calle de Chihuahua, justo frente a su puerta, hay un edificio que se cayó en el año 85, en el terremoto.
Jesus Rodriguez commented that in front of the house where Leonora Carrington, the surrealist artist, lived in Colonia Roma, there was a building that collapsed in the 1985 earthquake, and the ruins were left there.
Y hasta la fecha, ese edificio está habitado.
And that building continues to be inhabited until today.
Por supuesto está derruido, pero sigue la gente viviendo ahí.
It collapsed, but the people live in the ruins.
Y lo que han hecho es poner enfrente una serie de anuncios para que no se vea la ruina.
So what someone has done is to cover the front of the building with giant billboards so that you cannot see the ruins behind.
Entonces llama la atención que es muy surrealista ahí que haya vivido Leonora y justo sus vecinos de frente vivan de esa manera, pero lo más increíble es que en México es esa simulación, basta con poner un anuncio y dejar la ruina.
So one can think of it as a surrealist moment, across from this great surrealist artist, but it's also, Jesus also thinks that it's a typical Mexican simulation, where there's always an effort to present this clean facade to hide something terrible behind it.
Bueno, y muchas gracias por sus pláticas.
Gracias.
So we're going to hear now from our exhibitors, and I'm going to give a little introduction first to what the Global Urban Humanities Initiative and what the Urban Humanities Initiative has been working on. We're shifting now geographically to China and a bunch of other places around the world, but we're also focusing now on methods and ways of looking at cities, which is kind of the center of what our Global Urban Humanities and Urban Humanities initiatives are about. So what these initiatives are doing are experimenting with bringing together hybrid and mixed methods of studying cities. So we've had a number of experts from different fields speaking right now, from art history, from literature, and so on. And what we've done in our team taught courses is to bring together faculty from different departments to teach together. And not just side by side, but actually weaving together different methods and bringing together students from archaeology, anthropology, architecture, comp lit, art history, art practice, rhetoric, music, city planning, landscape architecture. All of these students work together in these studios and other courses, learning to borrow each other's methods and adapt them to their own uses. And so what's been really interesting is that, for example, if you have an archaeology student taking out, say, landscape architecture or city planning students out to do some field work, they really teach those designers and planners to slow down and really look at the piece of dirt that they're planning to do something to, because the archaeologist is not out there to design and bring about change and to fix problems as city planners and landscape architects and architects are wont to do, but are instead really doing some slow looking. And I think that's part of what's really valuable about what humanities and humanistic social sciences can bring to the design fields. On the other hand, what we've seen is that then the design students can say to the comp lit or the art history student who may not consider themselves an artist to take a piece of paper and a pen and say, make a mark. It's okay. You're not going to break anything. You can try some design, or take a map of a neighborhood, lay down some tracing paper and start designing. Just play with it, because if you are in that design mindset, you're going to have a very different, you're going to be looking at that site with different eyes than if you're in a purely interpretive mindset. So I'm going to now let the creators of these wonderful exhibitions and publications explain to you how they have combined methods and approaches. And we're doing this with an eye to thinking about, okay, well, how can we use these approaches to looking at Mexico City? So we'll start with Winnie Wong from Rhetoric. And do you, okay. And Jose Figueroa from who's an MFA student, correct? And Edere, who's an architecture graduate student, and Margaret Crawford from the architecture department, and Valentina Rosa Kraus, who's from architecture, right? And they'll tell you about Art Village and City.
Okay, this is our team, plus I see some other fabulous members of our group in the back here. And what we did was have a research studio last spring based on the concept here, Art plus Village plus City in the Pearl River Delta area of China. We had students from many departments. We took a 2-week trip to the Pearl River Delta where we visited a number of villages and documented them. We came back, we had a final review, and then over the summer with our team here, we produced an exhibition that's now available to be visited in the Worcester Gallery. And it's a complicated exhibition, so I don't think we can really describe it here. But we would urge all of you to go and visit it during the break. Some of us will be there if you have any questions. We have a catalog and tote bags available for purchase. Thank you.
Maybe I can just add one thing, which is that this website you see here is a companion to our exhibition, but it in fact is a story of the pedagogical journey of the studio, and every one of the drawings on this website was done by one of the students, Jose, in the class, and the text on it is sort of reflections from myself and one of the students in the class on what the journey was for all of us. So I encourage you to come see the exhibition, come see the original drawings there, and also visit this website. Okay, thank you.
And so next up we have Dana Cuff, professor of architecture at UCLA, and Jonathan Chrisman, who is the project director of the Urban Humanities Initiative at UCLA.
Thank you. Well, like the Berkeley team, we also have an exhibition that's testing different ideas about what exhibitions might look like with the urban humanities model in mind of a cross-disciplinary urban experience. And we'll be very brief. Really what we've been doing at UCLA has been a kind of methodological investigation that's wrapped around ideas about film, thick mapping, and spatial ethnography. So what you'll see in the exhibition are 8 films that were made in Shanghai after about a year's worth of study, both in Shanghai and in UCLA, of literature, film, history, architecture, urban studies. And those films range from all types of genres, from the sort of traditional city film to documentary to a fable to a travelogue. And they're not intended to be, they're intended to actually explore multivocal narratives about that city rather than to express some kind of crisp understanding of what the student's experience was there. And Jonathan's going to talk a little bit about the maps that you'll also see on the wall.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, I thought I would just kind of leave with this last comment to kind of frame the work more broadly in terms of the way we approached it theoretically, which really drew on this idea from Geertz of thickness, that we were exploring media that could embed this polyvocality, multiple meanings that are often conflicting into a single medium to explore the sort of similarly conflicting and complex nature of the city. And also Geertz's approach of fiction, that it's not something fake, but rather something fashioned, that in fact, through the creation of these maps and the films, it really is an act of building rather than simply one of analysis. So, yeah.
The work is the result of 24 students from urbanism, architecture, and the humanities, as well as Jonathan and my work, and our colleagues Anastasia Lukaitu Sedaris from planning, and Robert Chi from Asian languages and culture. So we'd like to meet you over there and show you the work.
Thanks.
And next up, we have Kirsten Larson, who is a master's student joint in architecture and city planning, and Karan Shankar, who is a PhD student in performance studies, and they're going to tell you about participatory urbanisms. And this particular partnership I'm very proud of, because it was kind of a blind date that Global Urban Humanities fixed these two up with. We were kind of a match.com, and it's been extremely fruitful, as you'll hear.
Too much information. Now we don't have to say it. Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten Larson, and as Susan said, I'm from the Departments of Architecture and City Planning.
And I'm Karan Shankar from the Department of Performance Studies, and we're very pleased to announce the launch of our publication, Participatory Urbanisms, supported by UC Berkeley's Global Urban Humanities Initiative and the Mellon Foundation. This is a peer-reviewed publication interrogating the participatory turn in contemporary urban studies, performance studies, and art practice. The current revival in participatory practices in both art and planning is in some ways a return to participatory ideas from the 1960s. However, given the multitude of arenas in which participatory activity has been proliferating in the past 2 decades, including a range of public, private, civil society, and hybrid formations, participation itself as a mode of engagement must be examined as a critical terrain of negotiation between the state, society, and market forces. This interdisciplinary publication places itself in the midst of these debates to assess the radical promise and the potential pitfalls of participation in both urban art and politics today.
Bracketing the art and participation suggests a blurring of conventional separation between the aesthetic and the political dimensions of urban participation. Urban practices, from spontaneous protest to organized minoritarian claims on urban space, are as aesthetic as they are political, and entail a reordering of the field of urban experience and perception. Today, participatory social movements have erupted as the ongoing mode of radical political engagement in urban spaces across the globe. These movements consist in multitudes of reclaiming a part of urban in plazas, parks, houses, and streets. In doing so, they redefine the field of urban experience collectively. This publication has 2 components. The first is an interactive, bilingual, in English and Portuguese platform of interviews featuring 20 urban practitioners in the cities of Sao Paulo and New Delhi. They map the multiple and disjunctive ways in which participation is enacted, from mobile performances of poetry and theater to citizen journalism on gentrification in Sao Paulo's Old City Center to radical neighborhood pedagogical initiatives in a New Delhi resettlement colony. To give you a sample of some interview responses, Pamela from Colectivo Pi, a feminist performance collective in Sao Paulo, says, quote, "We believe in the possibility of a welcoming city. It comes through the idea that you have to establish affectionate relationships, relationships of real complicity, of getting to know and not being afraid of the other, the unknown, the far away. How can we think about an architecture, about behaviors, about these possibilities within the city?"
And another example from New Delhi, from a media lab that was set up in Dakshinpuri, which is a working class neighborhood of New Delhi. When asked about urban citizenship, this was the answer we received. Urban citizenship is a complex philosophical question. Citizenship has its definitions having to do with rights and entitlements, and I think in this sense a lot of people are underprivileged in this city. But this is a limited notion of citizenship. Citizenship is about belonging. You are here in the city, and so the city is yours. Now that's a different order proposition, and a much more interesting one. A Delhi resident can use whatever means, tactics, or techniques available to make sure that she can survive in this city, make a living. The second component of this publication is a peer-reviewed anthology of 20 articles from a range of geographic and temporal sites, expanding methodological and theoretical debates around the theme of urban participation. And we're lucky that some of the contributors to the anthology are here today. Rebecca Keynes from the University of Regina, and I think we're expecting some Carolyn Duffy from Stanford University.
Jeanette Wiesel, who was a graduate of the PhD program in architecture here last year.
And Layla Forrest White, she's in comparative literature at UC Berkeley. So just to give you a sense of the breadth of the anthology, we've organized it around 4 themes: memory and the city body, austerity politics, participation and occupation, curating publics, and ruptures in neoliberal space. And we'd like to draw your attention to the contribution of 2 authors to give you a sampling of the interventions that this anthology makes on urgent contemporary urban questions. Kavita Kulkarni from NYU writes about Soul Summit, which is an open-air house music festival in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. She discusses how participatory co-production of both dance and music by largely Black and brown youth counteracts, quote, the spatiality of peripheralization and the temporality of extinction imposed on Black urban life in the US. She continues, one could say that the social and political significance of Soul Summit centers on its participatory nature, and not only who participates, but also where, in public space and in historically Black, rapidly gentrified neighborhoods.
In the section Austerity Politics, Participation and Occupation, Andrea Micu from Northwestern University writes about the ongoing Indignados housing rights movement in Spain and Italy to theorize what she terms indignant performances. Quote, indignant performances are manifestations of shifting political economic landscapes specific to late capitalist processes that have left big sectors of the population in a state of precarity in Spain and Italy. She continues, when indignant bodies come together, they construct an entity full of political impulses. Indignant performances of protest in public space effectively construct the collective body of the crowd as an entity that is powerful enough to perpetually regenerate itself despite individual bodies being dragged, grabbed, pushed, arrested, and beaten.
This publication has been the result of our collaboration over the past year and a half. We took part in, discussed, read, mapped, wrote, designed, and imagined all aspects together. So as we launch today, we hope that this platform continues to spark conversation and collaboration. And while this is primarily a web publication, we also have a limited print run of copies for sale in the lobby. So we hope you'll join us for a walk through our exhibition following this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, we have also from UC Berkeley, Lawrence Yang from East Asian Languages and Cultures, and Mia Norell from Architecture, who will present a special issue of Room 1000 called Urban Pilgrimage.
Hi, my name is Mia Norell, and I'm on the editorial board of Room 1000, which is the architecture journal that's produced here at UC Berkeley. We had the pleasure of partnering with the Global Urban Humanities program on our most recent issue, which is on urban pilgrimage. I'm actually here speaking on behalf of Padma Maitland, who was unable to be here today. He's traveling the world. But Padma was the founder of this journal, and we wanted to allow him to speak for this issue. He and Lawrence were the co-managing editors of the issue. So I'll read a short statement by Padma. This special issue on urban pilgrimage brings together over 30 pieces from a wide range of disciplines, including comparative literature, English, art, architecture, planning, area studies, and history, to ask what draws and moves us towards and through cities. Pilgrimage is a chance to participate through directed movement in the special significance of a place. While traditionally guided towards religious sites, rethinking pilgrimage in the modern urban context is a way to reconsider how modes of experiencing and understanding transformation through travel have changed or remain the same. Similarly, reemphasizing the role of pilgrimage in the contemporary city asks us to question where meaning in the urban context lies today and the new circuits that define and affirm value in the city through movement to and from sites of attraction and interest. The assembled pieces in this journal present a broad historical and global perspective on pilgrimage in the city. Some consider archaeological sites or ancient temple cities. Others consider the new forms of movement such as GeoGuessr and Google Earth, or the modern pilgrimage sites of film archives and public forums like the UN or World Court. The essays also take a diversity of approaches to the topic, including pilgrimage accounts, digital mappings, photography, drawing, and film. Some are longer research projects, parts of dissertations or multi-year studies, while some are narratives, reflections on personal engagements with pilgrimage. The essays are grouped according to 3 subsections: roots, temporary urbanism, and the traveled voice. While each piece could fall into any one of the categories, and each of the categories could in themselves be a focus of study, we felt this arrangement was a way to begin a conversation about different possible approaches to what we're calling urban pilgrimage. So we're thrilled that we have the print copy of the journal here today. We have a table outside where you can look through it. It is available for sale, but we are also really thrilled that we have the entire issue of all of our journals available on our website, which is room1000.com. So we hope that you can come and engage with us and the material. Thank you.